Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 380 of the Prancing Pony podcast, where, well, the divergence between the pronunciation and idiom of the Man of the West and the Sage of the South is greater, far greater, than has been shown in this podcast.
Alan indeed speaks for the most part a rustic dialect after all.
Dude, what are you talking about, man?
Folks, pull up a bench in the common room and join us. I'm James Tauber, the Sage of the South, and I'm here with the Man of the West who wouldn't know the deferential form of the second person pronoun and wouldn't use it even if he did, Alan Sisto.
The strangeness of Alan's speech is well known. Folks, join us as we look deep into Tolkien's explanations for how and why he translated things the way he did in the second half of Appendix F on translation.
Indeed. Folks, no matter how you arrived, you're all welcome here in the common room. At the Prancing Pony podcast, we're reading and talking our way through Middle-earth, with plenty of speculation and bad jokes along the way.
That's for sure. We do love our deep dives into the lore, though, discussing our favorite themes and connections and a whole lot more.
But we try to keep it light and fun, like a couple of friends chatting at the pub. And we're glad you've joined us.
And I'm sure you'll be glad you joined as well. But before we get to tonight's chapter discussion, well, we've told you before, there's a long line at the North Wing. So we've got an extra special treat for the second week in a row. It's time to step into the North Wing and visit with one of our listeners. And today, we're bringing you another new installment of The North Wing.
Barleyman Butterbur had a room or two in the North Wing at the Prancing Pony Inn, made special for hobbits. And this is our place made special for some of our listeners, to give us a chance to get to know them.
Now, rooms at the North Wing are a little hard to come by, so only our patrons at the Elrond's Honorarium and Círdan's Contribution tiers are eligible. If you'd like to be one of the next patrons to join us, be sure to check out patreon.com/prancingponypod.
Please do. We've got a waiting list for the North Wing right now, but we'll get to them all soon, and we'll make room for more if necessary.
Well then, James, why don't we go ahead and welcome tonight's guest to the North Wing, Lewis Kiner, though I know him better as Tsunami. Lewis.
Hey, how are you doing today?
We're doing all right. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? What do you do? And then what do your loved ones think of all this Tolkien stuff you're into? That sort of thing.
Sure. Well, I'm originally from Virginia, from Fredericksburg, Virginia, but right now I'm a college professor at a public university in South Carolina.
Oh, right on.
And my area of interest is at the intersection of physics and oceanography, hence the tsunami. And what I do is I use imaging data provided by satellites to study the coastal oceans.
Oh, wow.
And so that's what I've been doing research on and teaching over the past, however many years. But recently, though, I've been the director of an interdisciplinary program at my university. So it's mostly administrative work. And so that's a bad part. But the good part is that I get to teach seminars on pretty much anything I want.
Oh, fun.
And I've even been able to teach a seminar recently on Tolkien and science. So that was really fun.
Ooh, that would be.
So that's me, and I have a great family. I have a wife and daughter. My wife teases me about my Tolkien obsession, but she is very supportive.
Good.
And my daughter is a big fan of Tolkien.
Right on.
Recently bringing over all of her friends for like a marathon of both Lord of the Rings movies and the Hobbit movies. I tried to dissuade them from the second one, but
I was wondering if you were going to go there. Yeah.
No, well, but I don't think she had really a choice. She actually saw The Fellowship of the Ring when she was less than a year old. We took her to the midnight showing back in December of 2001, I believe, and she basically obviously slept through the whole thing, but she was there for the premiere of Fellowship of the Ring.
Oh, that's great. I love that.
Wonderful. Okay, the question we ask everyone who comes to the Prancing Pony: when and how did you first discover Tolkien's works? What was the experience like, and why do you keep coming back?
So I think I, like a lot of people, came to Tolkien through C.S. Lewis.
Oh, wow.
I was in middle school, and the Narnia Chronicles were in my church library. And so I read them. I really enjoyed them. But of course, at the end, then I asked, okay, well, what's next?
Yes.
I don't know if it was a friend or a librarian or someone who, but I was given The Fellowship of the Ring to read. And if you remember, it was like the 1970s white copies with the Tolkien's illustrations on the front. And I remember where it was in my middle school library. So that was the beginning. And of course, I got my own. I know you remember these, the red, green, and blue Darrell K. Sweet illustrated ones. So those are the ones that were just dog-eared, and I think I still have them, but they're in pieces.
That was my first set as well. They actually fully disintegrated. I had to buy a replacement set for sentimental value.
So I remember reading the Silmarillion in middle school. I remember that because I had a shop teacher who was also into it, and so we were discussing Tolkien in shop class.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And in high school, I actually had a English teacher who did a semester class on Tolkien.
Wow.
And that was the cool part. The odd part was that was the first time I actually saw the Ralph Bakshi animated version. We watched that in class. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting.
Interesting is a good word to apply to that film.
Yeah. But beyond that, I guess just after that, I remember I was in a bookstore when I saw this thing called Unfinished Tales on the shelf.
Oh, yes.
And I just remember my reaction. Oh, there's more. Oh my God, there's more. And so that really set off for me a lifetime of collecting and studying Tolkien's works.
Oh, that's great.
I keep coming back to it even now because at different times in my life, it's been able to provide me provide me solace at times. Mm-hmm. It's been a source of inspiration. It's been an opportunity for academic study. Most of all, it's entertaining. It's a story well told.
Oh, you're not kidding. And that was what at least one of Tolkien's own goals, right? Was just to try my hand at telling a really long story. And like you said, he did it well. So which is your favorite book in the Legendarium and why? And if you have a favorite non-Legendarium work of his, what is it?
So I guess my favorite book, and we'll go with books, I guess is book 3.
Yes.
First part of Two Towers.
Mm-hmm.
I just love the imagery of the of Rohan and the Fanghorn, and just that just really transports me there. That entire book there. And so if I have a favorite one, it's that one. But obviously they're all great.
Yeah, that's fair. Any non-Legendarium works?
Non-Legendarium, I guess I'm going to have to go with Smith of Wootton Major.
Good choice.
Yeah, it's a delightful story. Really deep, though.
It is. It's really a wonderful example of fairy and
right,
and the perils of such. Yes,
mm-hmm.
Right.
Any Tolkien goals that you'd like to share? Tracking down a special book for your collection, going to a moot, anything like that?
I think as far as collecting goes, I'm collected out as far as like all of the I've got several copies of all the standard things, mm-hmm. and pretty much at this point, I'd have to start opening up the wallet a little bit more than I'd want to. So mm-hmm. I think I'm good on collecting. However, I really want to get to Oxenmoot sometime. That's a goal of mine. So
that's a great event.
If I had to head to one, that's it.
That's a worthy goal, Oxenmoot for sure. And now it's time for a lightning round. Quick questions and answers. Who's your favorite character in The Lord of the Rings?
Well, it has to be Gandalf. I've identified with Gandalf since the first time I read it. Other characters, I used to identify with Frodo when I was small. Then I identified with Aragorn, or I guess, let me put it this way, I aspired to be Aragorn.
Yeah.
And as I'm getting older and older, I feel a lot more like Theoden. I feel a lot more like Theoden pre-healing.
Breathe the free air, my friend.
Thank you. But yeah, overall, definitely Gandalf. That is my personality right there.
All right.
What about a favorite scene or moment in the Legendarium?
I think I'm always going back to the battles, and that may not be all that unique, but just the inspiration of the charge of the Rohirrim and the dawning of the sun over Helm's Deep, mm-hmm. and just the hope coming when there was despair. That's something I keep going back to, and so really, it's probably a lot of people's favorites, but yeah, those are my favorites.
All right, what about your favorite Hobbit?
Favorite Hobbit, definitely Frodo.
All right,
I've always identified with Frodo. Oh, and I do have to say, book Frodo.
Yes, that's fair. That's fair.
Okay, Rivendell or Lorien?
Oh, definitely Rivendell. I mean, that's again, I think I'll have a lot of company there if we ever get to go.
I think so.
But both the descriptions in the novels, and also I think Peter Jackson did a wonderful job at just visualizing sort of what I visualized Rivendell as, with the mountains, with the water.
Yeah.
And I would just love to just spend so much time in the library and in the Great Hall. And I could just live there like Bilbo for years and years.
Favorite poem or song in the Legendarium?
Okay. So I'm gonna be a bit weird here and say the Mulips.
Oh,
just simply because when I read that, I'm like, this is weird and this is kind of cool. This is creepy.
Creepy, yeah.
But once again, it's done well. It's done creepy, done well.
Yeah,
so.
it is. And folks, for those of you who don't know where that is, it's not in the Lord of the Rings. It's in the Adventures of Tom Bombadil. So you could make the argument that it's not quite Legendarium, but it is. It is Legendarium because, of course, it's Tom, and there's all sorts of things in there that connect to it.
It's the extended universe Legendarium.
Yeah, exactly. That's what we'll call it. All right.
Exactly. Okay, last question. Favorite author or book other than Tolkien?
Definitely going with Terry Pratchett here.
Okay.
I adore his works. I adore his ability to combine parody of fantasy, but also satire, like and commentary on social events. And I just his growth throughout all of his writings. His last few books are just so powerful, and they are some of my favorites. That if I'm not reading Tolkien, I'm reading Terry Pratchett.
All right, fair enough. Great answers. Thank you, Lewis. We have really enjoyed having you here in the North Wing. It is time for all of us, though, to head back to the common room to join the rest of the listeners.
Thanks again, and we'll see you back at our next Questions After Nightfall, if not sooner.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you. And now we return you to the podcast in progress.
Okay, let's get lost on translation, I guess.
Let's indeed.
Take it away, Alan.
Easy to get lost in, on, or around translation. On translation. In presenting the matter of the Red Book as a history for people of today to read, the whole of the linguistic setting has been translated as far as possible into terms of our own times. Only the languages alien to the common speech have been left in their original form, but these appear mainly in the names of persons and places. The common speech, as the language of the hobbits and their narratives, has inevitably been turned into modern English. In the process, the difference between the varieties observable in the use of the Westron has been lessened. Some attempt has been made to represent varieties by variations in the kind of English used, but the divergence between the pronunciation and idiom of the Shire and the Westron tongue in the mouths of the elves or of the Highmen of Gondor was greater than has been shown in this book. Hobbits indeed spoke for the most part a rustic dialect, whereas in Gondor and Rohan, a more antique language was used, more formal and more terse. One point in the divergence may here be noted, since, though important, it has proved impossible to represent. The Westron tongue made in the pronouns of the second person, and often also in those of the third, a distinction, independent of number, between familiar and deferential forms. It was, however, one of the peculiarities of Shire usage that the deferential forms had gone out of colloquial use. They lingered only among the villagers, especially of the West Farthing, who used them as endearments. This was one of the things referred to when people of Gondor spoke of the strangeness of Hobbit speech. Peregrine Took, for instance, in his first few days in Minas Tirith, used the familiar for people of all ranks, including the Lord Denethor himself. This may have amused the aged steward, but it must have astonished his servants. No doubt this free use of the familiar forms helped to spread the popular rumor that Peregrine was a person of very high rank in his own country. It will be noticed that hobbits, such as Frodo, and other persons, such as Gandalf and Aragorn, do not always use the same style. This is intentional. The more learned and able among the hobbits had some knowledge of book language, as it was termed in the Shire, and they were quick to note and adopt the style of those whom they met. It was in any case natural for much-traveled folk to speak more or less after the manner of those among whom they found themselves, especially in the case of men who, like Aragorn, were often at pains to conceal their origin and their business.
Wonderful stuff. So we're getting near the end of the appendices, and now it's time to sort of look behind the curtain and get first-hand explanation from Tolkien as to how he's represented various languages, and just as importantly, why.
I love this because it's a chance to really hear from Tolkien himself. I mean, he's writing to us as him now.
Right. It's not the narrator anymore. It's Tolkien for the modern reader.
Exactly. He's no longer the chronicler or the historian. He's no longer even the translator. He's just him telling us why he's made these decisions. It's really
exactly.
cool.
And yet he still uses terms like history to describe what he's done.
And I love that. I was going to actually point that out immediately. I love that conceit that the Red Book is, quote, a history for people of today to read. And, we've seen this before. If nothing else, Tolkien's very consistent on this point. And since it's a history for us to read, Tolkien has, very kindly translated the whole of the linguistic setting.
But not everything, right? Languages that he says are alien to common speech or Westron were left as they are, with some interesting nuances there that we'll get into.
I was going to say there are some slight tweaks here and there.
But the common speech has, as it would need to be for us to read it, translated into modern English.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine if you pick up The Lord of the Rings and it's just in Westron? And you've got some guide at the back that tries to help you translate it yourself.
Yes.
No, thank you very much. Note the point that he makes here about the common speech, that the reason why it's been translated this way is because that's the language of the hobbits and their stories. Again, with the consistency of this being a Hobbit-centric story.
Exactly. And we're going to see that time and time again, that things are always done from the point of view of the hobbits, including the language side of things.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So Tolkien's careful to explain that because of how the common speech is translated into English, he's been unable to accurately represent some of the differences between the different peoples that speak Westron. He gives an example. The difference between the way that common speech is pronounced in the Shire and the idioms that are used versus the way the elves or Gondorian highmen speak it. It's even bigger in reality than it is in the book.
That's something, because it feels like it's already pretty big. I mean, if you think about like Farmer Cotton or Ted Sandyman, or Bill Fernie, and how different they are from like Glorfindel in the way they speak.
Exactly, and this is something that I'm continuing to do research on ultimately as part of my PhD. But in my master's dissertation, and I gave a talk at Oxenmoot on this as well, I looked at the way that different characters speak. And one of the things that I looked at, just as a simple example for those of you who aren't aware of this work, just looking at contractions, and in particular, the way that do not is contracted to don't. And this actually plays in really nicely to the remark that Tolkien makes about people like, and he lists Frodo, Gandalf, and Aragorn as examples of characters whose languages change depending on who they were talking to. Yeah. And you see that even just in this simple mechanism of, do you say do not or do you say don't? Because for the most part, if you look at any Gondorian, any elf, they will never contract do not to don't. They always say do not. Whereas all of the hobbits, with just a handful of exceptions, will always contract to don't. And the exceptions are Frodo, Merry, and Pippin.
Who are, of course, more educated, more of that book learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Gandalf and Aragorn also can freely switch between whether they contract or not.
But when they switch is based on who they're talking to, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And there's a bunch of other things. I want to read some examples of the way that Tolkien tries to bring across these differences, in particularly some of the idioms that he used. One of my favorite things is whenever you get the more rustic hobbits, shall we say, he really brings in certain dialectal forms in English. He's saying he's not quite able to convey the differences as much as they existed, but we still get a real sense of it, right? For example, Daddy Two-Foot in the first chapter, very, very early on, says, and no wonder they're queer if they live on the wrong side of Brandywine River and right agin the old forest. Agin being a dialect form for against. He says, right agin the old forest. That's a dark, bad place if half the tales be true. Doesn't say if half the tales are true. He says if half the tales be true.
Very piratey there.
We get the strangest, the way Tolkien writes Jules, J-O-O-L-S.
Oh, yeah, J-O-O-L-S. I love that.
Just to try to convey this. And you get, the gaffer saying, Mr. Bilbo has learned him his letters.
Yeah. Not meaning him any harm.
Exactly. Meaning no harm, Mark you, yeah. Or Old Noak saying it was Drogo's weight as sunk the boat. As sunk the boat. I think it's a really interesting one. And then one of my favorites, these are all in the first chapter, but one of my favorites towards the end in the Scouring of the Shire is all the stuff that Farmer Cotton says.
Yeah.
And I'll just read some examples of this that, they moves about and comes and goes. The bosses, they names him. So the way that he's inflecting those verbs. He don't go outside the grounds now, right? That double negative. The men don't let no one go near. So it's fascinating the way he does that. And of course you get some of these archaisms, like when Sam says, I love him whether or no.
Yes.
That expression, whether or no, meaning, no matter what.
Regardless, right.
It's really interesting. And then on the other side, you get the sort of the way that the high speech is conveyed. One of the things that gets talked about a lot is the inversion of particularly when you negate something. Like if you and I say, we say we don't care.
Right.
Whereas Aragorn says, I care not.
I care not. Yeah. It is very formal.
Exactly. I care not now whether you say Aranian. So it's just fascinating that Tolkien does this, brings in these different dialects of English, although, as he said, the actual difference between the way that the common speech was spoken among these people was even greater than he's able to convey.
I'm trying to imagine that, but he does talk a little bit more about that, I should say, in the draft. We've looked at draft F2 a few times last week, and here he says the same thing there, but even more so in terms of that distinction. He says, the differences between the use of this speech in different places and by persons of higher and lower degree, for example, by Frodo and by Sam in the Shire and in Gondor or among the elves, I have tried to represent by variations in English of approximately the same kind. In the result, these differences have, I fear, been somewhat obscured. The divergence of the vocabulary, idiom, and pronunciation in the free and easy talk of the Shire from the daily language of Gondor was really greater than is here represented or could be represented without using a phonetic spelling for the Shire and an archaic diction for Gondor that would have puzzled or infuriated modern readers.
which I find funny because
he already does.
I think it's already
spelling.
pretty obvious. I think it's
already jewels, like you pointed out, and some of the others.
Yeah, but on the Gondor side, I think it already is pretty clear that people are speaking in a higher register and so on. One only wonders the extent to which he would have liked to have taken it. But yes, on the phonetic spelling sort of thing, we get a little bit of it, like in the trolls in the Hobbit.
The trolls in the Hobbit are great. Yeah,
trying to bring across, but it is quite difficult to convey pronunciation differences in writing.
That is true. Yeah,
and it can make it very difficult to read. I don't know if you've ever read the novel Cloud Atlas, but Cloud Atlas has a chapter that's written entirely in a fictitious dialect many years in the future of sort of where English may have gone, and it's very very difficult to read.
I get a little bit of that. Actually, did you ever read The Expanse, where the Belter patois?
Of course. Yeah.
When you read it in writing, it is
it's much more difficult. Yeah,
much more difficult. I mean, it was nice to sort of see it represented on the screen when they adapted it to television.
That was my experience of it, and that was very well done. But a great example of trying to convey that true dialect difference, not just really the subtleties of whether you contract or don't contract.
Yeah.
But, slang and different accent and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
Yeah,
and it makes you wonder what would it look like had Tolkien actually been able to represent that. But it would have been even harder to read the Men of Gondor or the High Elves.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
even harder to then understand necessarily the pronunciation of folks from the Shire.
Yeah. Then we get into the difference regarding the familiar or versus formal second person pronouns. Now, I know you and Don talked about this difference at length a couple of seasons back when Eowyn kept referring to Aragorn with thee and thou, while Aragorn kept her at arm's length with you.
Yeah, that's a red flag right there. Exactly. If your date keeps calling you and you keep calling her thee, just go home, call it a day.
Here, Tolkien uses the opportunity to explore the fact that in the Shire, the deferential forms were no longer used at all.
Of course they weren't. It's the Shire. With the exception, by the way, he says, of the villagers in the West Farthing. That will come into play in a little bit. They only use them as terms of endearment. That is, of course, the West Farthing, where Hobbiton and Bywater are. So we will cover that again in a little bit.
Yeah. So when Pippin immediately uses the familiar for everyone, including the steward Denethor, it took folks by surprise and it's said to have possibly amused Denethor.
I don't know if amused is the word I would have used. Denethor doesn't strike me as the type to be amused. Just less peeved than usual. But yeah, he's I can just see it now. Hey, what's going on, man? How you doing, buddy? Denethor like, well, that's charming in a way. All right. In fact, according to the text, this led, at least in part, to the spreading of that rumor, right? That Pippin was a prince of the hobbits.
Which I love it. This idea that, you could only get away with doing that if you were somebody important.
If you were nobility, if you were,
right.
Of course,
exactly.
the irony is that Pippin is a prince of the hobbits, essentially.
Essentially, yeah.
He is hobbit royalty. Yeah.
It's funny. There's a story I read recently about Mark Cuban showing up for a meeting in a T-shirt.
Yes. Yeah.
And basically the story being that's how you know
the most dangerous guy is the guy in the T-shirt. Yeah,
exactly. And it's the same sort of thing, right? The most who is this guy that's getting away with the familiar second person pronoun? Huh? So man. Before we come back to that West Farthing bit, there's a footnote to this that we should cover. Tolkien writes that in one or two places, an attempt has been made to hint at these distinctions by an inconsistent use of thou. Since this pronoun is now unusual and archaic, it is employed mainly to represent the use of ceremonious language. But a change from you to thou and thee is sometimes meant to show there being no other means of doing this, a significant change from the deferential or between men and women normal forms to the familiar.
That's really important because that whole little bit that, look, there's no other way for me to show a transition from deferential, which would be the normal mode of communication between men and women. And that's important, right? The normal mode of communication between Eowyn and Aragorn in that scene in the Passing of the Great Company would have been the deferential, which is just the you, the arm's length you, and the thee and thou is the intimate. So it definitely seems like it's a reference to the Eowyn-Aragorn conversation.
Right.
What's interesting is that in F2, Tolkien explicitly connects it to a conversation involving Eowyn, but not the one that she has with Aragorn. He writes there, on the other hand, the sudden use of thou, thee in the dialogue of Faramir and Eowyn is meant to represent, there being no other means of doing this in English, a significant change from the courteous to the familiar. But by extension, we can also apply that then to the Eowyn-Aragorn conversation.
Of course.
Really
but it is interesting, this idea that you can't just use the differential versus familiar all the time in the translation, because that would seem odd to us because we're not used to that. You have to be careful about when you choose to do it. But coming back to this idea then that in the Shire, villages in the West Farthing still use the differential forms as terms of endearment. In F2, Tolkien writes, the thee used by Sam Gamgee to Rose at the end of the book is intentional, but corresponds there to his actual use of the old-fashioned courteous form as a sign of affection.
Just like a West Farthing villager. But wait a minute. When did Sam use thee in speaking to Rose? So, I'm like, wait a minute. Let me do a quick search for thee in the word. And it's not there. Sam doesn't say it. But for that, we go to something that at the time of Tolkien writing F2, Tolkien thought would have been in the book. And that's the epilogue. Now, Don and I covered the epilogue back in the very first episode of this season, 341, and here's the passage. The stars were shining in a clear sky. It was the first day of the clear, bright spell that came every year to the Shire at the end of March, and was every year welcomed and praised as something surprising for the time of the year. All the children were in bed. Lights were glimmering still in Hobbiton, and in many houses dotted about the darkening countryside. Sam stood at the door and looked away eastward. He drew Mistress Rose to him and held her close to his side. March 25th, he said. This time 17 years ago, Rose wife. I did not think I should ever see thee again, but I kept on hoping. I just get chills. I love that the epilogue has at least eventually been published. I agree with Tolkien that it was best that he didn't include it in the book, but man, that hits. It's beautiful.
It does.
And I love that he even addressed that thee. As being like, this isn't a sudden change in the way he's communicating, whether this is a term of endearment.
Yeah.
It's a very sweet, old-fashioned, courteous form. It's so neat.
Yeah. So the text then goes on to point out something we've often talked about, and that Tolkien assumes will have been noticed, that people speak in very different styles.
Like we were talking about earlier, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, the learned hobbits have book language, Frodo, Merry, Pippin. Bilbo, interestingly, John, the contraction point tends not to do so. So Bilbo actually... Right.
He's sort of in the middle.
He's an interesting middle.
Yeah,
exactly.
He's a bridge case, isn't he?
Exactly. And they have an ability to adapt to the style of the person that they're talking to.
It's true. And of course, that same adaptability is seen among people who travel a lot. I get that actually, because I interact with people from all around the world at various different places at moots and things. But it's especially the case for people like Aragorn, who, just doesn't want folks like Barliman up in his business.
Exactly.
He's a secretive guy, and he needs to be a secretive guy. So he knows how to sort of shift modes.
Exactly. You don't. Why do you speak so posh? It's very suspicious. Yeah.
Yeah. Strider doesn't speak posh, but Elisar does.
Exactly. Yes. So we get this fascinating mention of how the free peoples have a reverence for the ancient, not just in language, but in other things. And they enjoy the ancient as well.
I love that. That was a neat little aside. It just kind of takes you back to one of the things that we see in the framework of the story as a whole is this sort of medieval viewpoint of it's not the progressive viewpoint. It's not the modern viewpoint that things are always improving. It's the flip of that things are always
the golden age.
Yes. The golden age is behind us. Ailed into your work. Gimli saying, there's great stonework here, but look, the old work is better than the new work. And, that kind of thing. So there is this both respect and really genuine joy for the older. Moving on to the elves, Tolkien explains that since they are particularly skilled in words, I mean, they're the ones who came up with speech, right? I mean, that's if I'm not mistaken, what those who speak, that's what Quendi means. So I mean, that's literally in the name. They have great skill in words. They're able to speak the common speech in a way that is structured, presumably idiomatically and grammatically, close to their own speech in a style that Tolkien says is even more antique than that of Gondor. So again, adaptability.
Exactly. And the dwarves are also adaptable, but we saw that in the section on the dwarves and how they don't want anyone to know their tongue at all.
Yeah, so they'll just adapt, right?
This is contrasted with the evil creatures, orcs and trolls. They're said to communicate without loving words, which for a philologist like Tolkien is the ultimate statement of their evil character.
I totally thought so. I'm reading that as like a hard slam on these peoples, because if you don't love words, what kind of person are you?
Exactly. That is the ultimate evil.
Yeah. And talk about, Tolkien unable to show, he's already talked about how I can't show the difference between hobbits of the Shire and say the elves in Rivendell. There's just not a wide enough gap in English to show you that. The common speech of the orcs and trolls was even worse than Tolkien could show it. And he draws this parallel between their degraded and filthy talk and modern talk that is similar. He says that comes from the orc-minded. He even describes what that looks like. And it's one of those things where you just, I wish he were alive today. I wonder who he would be, absolutely slamming here. Dreary, repetitive, hateful, contemptuous, and squalid. I love those words.
Yeah.
Squalid in particular is good.
In F2, he adds that if he'd tried to use an English more near to the reality, it would have been intolerably disgusting and to many readers, hardly intelligible.
What would that have looked like?
I wonder if that's still true today, because, of course, one of the things, particularly in England, there was for a long time a lot of judgment about the way that people spoke. And there's certainly been a shift. I've seen it even myself in terms of, there once was a time where you had to speak a particular way to be an announcer on the BBC.
Yeah.
Right. There was very clear rules about how you had to speak on television. And that's obviously shifted. You get much greater variety of accents on television now. So I doubt it would have been quite as intolerably disgusting for us to have different accents. But that's the kind of thing I imagine Tolkien's talking about. That
and just vulgar too. I mean, I imagine the orcs and trolls speaking with the kind of language that Tolkien would not want to write down.
Yes.
Yes.
Rude words, crassness.
Yeah, exactly. Rude words, curses, and profanity and vulgarity. And for him, that's not something he wants to be writing. And he'd like to think that his readers would not want to read that. But we all know as readers also read G.R.R. Martin, who has no problem using plenty of those.
One thing I just want to bring up, though, is Tolkien, on the other hand, despite what I sort of said about judgments made of people's accents, Tolkien also, though, had a love of dialect forms and his teacher, Joseph Wright, I have to always bring up Joseph Wright in this regard,
of course,
is a perfect example of this. Joseph Wright himself brought up in very rural Yorkshire, had a thick accent, and spent much of his life documenting the different dialects of the UK before they died out, because they were dying out in the early 20th century. So Tolkien, I don't think, would have had necessarily as much of a judgment around, that's a Yorkshire accent and we don't like Yorkshire people. I think he would have appreciated that sort of variety a lot more. We're probably talking about something different here. As you say, it's more about the crassness and I
don't think we're talking about accents or anything or even idioms. I think he's talking about, the words that he talked about earlier: degraded and filthy talk, dreary, repetitive, hateful, contemptuous, squalid. Yeah. That's the kind of the content of the speech.
Yep.
Yes. And he would have not liked that. This is probably as good a point as any in the episode to bring in a few things that Tolkien wrote about in letter number 144 to Naomi Mitchison in 1954. Now, as a reminder, Miss Mitchison had been helping Tolkien by reading the page proofs of the first 2 volumes of The Lord of the Rings. In that process, of course, she had lots and lots of questions, and we see a lot of really cool letters from Tolkien to her in the collection that are very insightful. His responses are great, but we're going to focus, of course, on his thoughts about language and translation. James?
Yeah, so he says that Return of the King had been completed years ago, as far as the story was concerned, and that he was spending what fragments of time he had to, quote, make compressed versions of such historical, ethnographical, and linguistic matter as can go in the appendix. And he even offered to send her a rather rough copy of what we now know as Appendix F for her review. And in doing so, he then acknowledged that translation has, quote, given me much thought.
He makes the very real point that other world-building authors, even really good ones, don't appear to even touch on the issue of translation at all. They just don't even think about it. Tolkien admits, I am a philologist, and much though I should like to be more precise on other cultural aspects and features, that is not within my competence. Anyway, language is the most important, for the story has to be told and the dialogue conducted in a language.
I just have to point out that it's funny that he says that he would have liked to have been more precise on other cultural aspects. It's not within my competence. That didn't stop him doing all the calendar stuff.
No, I was going to say it didn't stop him trying.
And the moon phases.
And I would dare say, Tolkien, it wasn't that it wasn't within your competence. It might not have been within your expertise.
Yes.
But you proved to be more than competent in many of these things. Yeah.
Exactly. But as he says, right, the dialogue, the story has to be told in the dialogue conducted in a language. Obviously not in English, though, since this wasn't the time or place for that language to exist.
Right.
Instead, Tolkien says that he had equated the common speech with English and translated all the names into English words, quote, with some differentiation of style, like we mentioned when discussing the text. Mm-hmm. Now, he admits that there was a problem with languages that were related to the Westron and gives the Rohirric language as an example. Since the Rohirrim are represented as recent comers out of the north and users of an archaic mannish language relatively untouched by the influence of Eldarin, I have turned their names into forms like, but not identical with, Old English. Mm-hmm. Similarly, he adds that the language of the Men of the Dale and the Long Lake would, quote, be represented as more or less Scandinavian in character, but it is only represented by a few names, especially those of the dwarves that came from that region. And there's that retcon again.
There it is. I'm trying to cover
How do I
myself.
explain why I used
why did I use Thorin and Glowin and
names? Yeah. Exactly. But it's a brilliant retcon and it makes total sense. Although we'll get the mailbag question that we have actually touches on some interesting issues with this idea that of what he did with the Rohirrim and the Men of the Dale.
I'll be looking forward to that. So it's the details that he provides in the Elvish languages that are what's really unique to this letter and not discussed in Appendix F. These languages, Tolkien explains, have some sort of existence since I have composed them in some completeness, as well as their history and account of their relationship. They are intended, A, to be definitely of a European kind in style and structure, not in detail, and B, to be specially pleasant. The former, obviously the style and structure, he says, is not difficult to achieve, but the latter, being pleasant, is more difficult since individuals' personal predilections, especially in the phonetic structure of languages, varies widely, even when modified by the imposed languages, including their so-called native tongue.
If you can't please everyone, please the most important person.
I know where this is headed.
Yeah, Tolkien then says, I have therefore pleased myself.
Good.
Before adding that what he says is the archaic language of law, that would be Quenya, is meant to be an Elvish Latin. Then he adds, it might be said to be composed on a Latin basis with two other main ingredients that happen to give me phonesthetic pleasure, Finnish and Greek. It is, however, less consonantal than any of the three.
Now, that's interesting. I knew about the Finnish influence. You kind of see the Finnish influence.
Mm-hmm.
I never knew about the Greek influence.
Yeah, Greek was one of his favorite languages. He did definitely have preferences for certain languages, and knew Greek well. Had studied it in
classics,
school.
of course.
He started off as a classicist.
Latin and Greek were his. Yeah, exactly.
But Greek in particular was what he loved within that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the other interesting thing here is this question of whether there are universal phonesthetics, right? He makes a point here that there's variation. People have personal predilections, and he went with what he liked the most.
Right.
But there's been some interesting research over the years about whether there are characteristics of languages that are more universally preferred to others. And it's interesting, a lot of the research that I've read in this area does look in particular at constructed languages. And it seems to be fairly universal that Quenya is rated amongst the most attractive of languages by people that know nothing about Tolkien. They're just given words and told which do you like the sound of better than others and so on. And Quenya consistently rates extremely highly.
It is a beautiful language. No
exactly. So Tolkien, even though he acknowledges that there is personal preference in this, I think he was also capturing some universals there about certain sounds and sound combinations that we find attractive.
Oh, that's fantastic. Now, when it comes to Sindarin, which we mostly see in the names of people and places, he says that is derived from an origin that it shares in common with Quenya. We talked about that last week with the split being kind of the whole reason why he had to write the Silmarillion. It was like, I need to write a story to explain why my languages fell apart. But in the letter 144, he writes, but the changes have been deliberately devised to give it a linguistic character very like, though not identical, with British Welsh, because that character is one that I find in some linguistic moods very attractive, and because it seems to fit the rather Celtic type of legends and stories told of its speakers. Now, the Welsh influence, again, on Sindarin is relatively well known. It's something we've talked about before on the show.
Yep.
It's interesting that he mentions the Celtic types of legends because wasn't there like a proofreader or somebody who once criticized, I think it was the Silmarillion, as being Celtic, and Tolkien dismissed it like he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yes, it was a reader for Alan and Unwin gave the feedback about the eye splitting Celtic names, and he had to point out they're not Celtic names. But yeah, of course, it's really fascinating that he loved Finnish and Greek, as we read, and loved Welsh. And conceived of a language that was Welsh-like and a language that was Finnish-like. But, of course, Finnish and Welsh are not related to one another.
Not at all, no.
But in his thinking, he wanted them to be related to one another.
And he could make some rules, some sound change rules.
Exactly. And that's, in a sense... Exactly. And that's, in a sense, the whole genesis of all this, right? It's kind of like, I like Finnish, I like Welsh. What if I made two languages that were actually related to one another, but one had the qualities of Finnish and the other had the qualities of Welsh? And then invent stories around why a split happened. But it's interesting, again, this kind of suggestion.
But instead, what if I just ordered a pizza and forgot about it? I mean, my goodness, what a crazy thing to think. Like, what if you what? What if you what now? What if I come up with an entire language that has Finnish influence and an entire language that has Welsh?
The really interesting thing, though, is it's not until Lord of the Rings that he decides to make the Welsh-like language associated with the Grey Elves. Because all through the early Legendarium, the Welsh-like language is Noldoran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, Gnomish.
Gnomish, yeah.
Originally, and then Noldoran, spoken by the Noldor.
Yeah.
Right? So what's interesting to me is that the language is even more important than the particular stories told. He could shift the language to a different set of
But
stories.
not the story.
In a way.
Yeah.
I'm all of a sudden going to change the backstory to this Welsh language. I'm going to keep the Welsh language.
Yeah, the language is going to stay the same.
But now I'm going to translate it over to the Grey Elves. And
that is amazing. Yeah.
Which is, I'm wondering, when he says seems to fit the rather Celtic type of legends and stories told by its speakers, is he suggesting there that there's something a little bit more Celtic about the Grey Elves?
The Grey Elves.
Maybe.
I wonder. Question.
I wonder.
Now, soon we'll get back to, well, hopefully no orc talk, nothing squalid here. But before we do, we want to remind you there's a lot more talk going on at the Prancing Pony podcast than just us, thankfully.
The PPP has an amazing listener community. They're always coming up with great questions and discussions across all our social media spaces. Check out our common room on Facebook, our dedicated subreddit, Twitter, and more.
Now, on Facebook, just look for the Prancing Pony podcast. Follow the page to get the news, but you're going to want to join the group to get involved in some great discussions.
On Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, Twitch, TikTok, and YouTube, we're at Prancing Pony Pod. Or if you prefer Reddit, find us there at r/PrancingPonyPod.
And if you want daily Tolkien content, check out Today's Tolkien Times on the PPP YouTube channel and on all your favorite podcast apps. That's my short format daily show with everything from Middle-earth Map Monday to Silmarillion Saturday. And there's my new twice weekly streaming of all fun things Middle-earth on the PPP Plays. Be sure to check both of them out on the YouTube channel for all the PPP productions at youtube.com/@PrancingPonyPod. But we have a whole lot more on translation to get through. James, would you pick up right after that?
Translation of this kind is, of course, usual, because inevitable in any narrative dealing with the past. It seldom proceeds any further. But I have gone beyond it. I have also translated all Westron names according to their censors. When English names or titles appear in this book, it is an indication that names in the common speech were current at the time, beside or instead of those in alien, usually Elvish, languages. The Westron names were, as a rule, translations of older names, as Rivendell, Horwell, Silverlode, Langstrand, the Enemy, the Dark Tower. Some differed in meaning, as Mount Doom for Orodruin, Burning Mountain, or Mirkwood for Taur y Daedalus, Forest of the Great Fear. A few were alterations of Elvish names, as Lune and Brandywine derived from Hlun and Baranduin. This procedure perhaps needs some defence. It seemed to me that to present all the names in their original forms would obscure an essential feature of the times as perceived by the hobbits, whose point of view I was mainly concerned to preserve. The contrast between a widespread language, to them as ordinary and habitual as English is to us, and the living remains of far older and more reverent tongues. All names, if merely transcribed, would seem to modern readers equally remote. For instance, if the Elvish name Imladris and the Westron translation Carnagal had both been left unchanged. But to refer to Rivendell as Imladris was as if one now was to speak of Winchester as Camelot, except that the identity was certain. While in Rivendell there still dwelt a lord of renown far older than Arthur would be, were he still king at Winchester today. The name of the Shire, Susa, and all other places of the Hobbits have thus been Englished. This was seldom difficult, since such names were commonly made up of elements similar to those used in our simpler English place names, either words still current like hill or field, or a little worn down like ton beside town. But some were derived, as already noted, from old Hobbit words no longer in use, and these have been represented by similar English things such as witch or bottle, dwelling, or Mitchell, great.
I love that. This is such a fun passage to get into, and because now we're moving into Tolkien's translation choices, specifically how he handled place names. And these, he says, he translated according to their senses. And that's kind of a central concept here. Everything's translated by sense.
Yeah, exactly. Explaining that often Westron names were themselves translations of older names, giving several examples. And he talks about Rivendell. The Sindarin name Imladris means deep dale of the cleft. So when Tolkien translates the Westron, which he provides later as Carningal, he translates it as Riven, Cloven, Dell.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if that's what it means, let's figure out how to represent that in English. The other examples he provides are similar in nature, right? Horwell, hor for grayish white and well for spring or stream, is the translation of the Sindarin Mythaethel from myth meaning pale gray, like Mithrandir, the Grey Wanderer, and Aethel, spring or source. They're all like that. I mean, we could go on, but we won't.
Indeed. Although I am in my current class on Tolkien's invented languages. This is exactly what we do.
I love it. Absolutely love it. But yeah, we'd be here for 4 hours today. Yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. Or 8 hours is how long the class goes for. But anyway, Tolkien acknowledges that sometimes the meanings change a bit. Orodruin, burning mountain or mountain of red flame, becomes Mount Doom. But in fairness, the men of Gondor called it Amon Amarth, which is Hill of Doom or Fate anyway.
Right. So, and then, of course, beside those translations by sense, some were just phonetic alterations of Elvish names as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not sure why Tolkien thinks his method of translation by sense needs defending, but he defends it.
Some defense. Really now? Who says? Because I don't think it does. But anyway.
But he defends it anyway, right? Giving the names in their actual Westron instead of in English with a sense of the same meaning would make all the languages alien and strange.
And I think this is where it's important because that conflicts with one of his primary goals. He wants to maintain the Hobbit's perspective, where there is a common widespread language alongside these remnants, these bits, these, what does he call them? Like sort of living remnants of ancient and more reverend languages. And he gives that specific example of Imladris. Look, I could have just called it Carningal since that's the Westron translation.
Right, but by giving it a name like Rivendell, translating Imladris by sense or meaning, it gives us this beautiful Camelot Arthur analogy that he gives, right? It was an analogy that was already strongly in place in F2. And I quote, to refer to Rivendell as Imladrist, changed to Imladris, was to men and hobbits as if one now was to speak of Winchester as Camelot, save the identity was certain. While in Rivendell there still dwelt a lord of renown older than Arthur would be, were he still living in Winchester today.
Exactly. So, I mean, he'd obviously thought about that long before. Now, of course, at that time, he hadn't landed on the final Westron name of Carningal. It was instead Carbandur, unintentionally making the point that both names would be quite alien and utterly meaningless, and that really only in this translation by sense could Tolkien preserve that Hobbit point of view.
Exactly. Yeah. Then we move on to the names of some of the Hobbit words, starting with the Shire, which he says they'd referred to as Susa. Not the Susa.
Not the Susa. That would be Suzat. Certainly not the Suzat. They might call it the Susa.
That's true. Well,
but not the
Suzat
translation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And while he's here, he doesn't go into any more on Susa for Shire, other than to say it's been Englished. I love that expression.
I love that word. That's been Englished.
He does spend some more time on it, though, in the draft F2 in Peoples. There he writes, the Shire seems to me very adequately to translate the Hobbit Suzat, since this word was now only used by them with reference to their country, though originally it had meant a sphere of occupation, as of the land claimed by a family or clan, of office or business. In Gondor, the word Susa was still applied to the division of the realms, such as Anorian, Ithilien, Lebanon, for which in Noldorian the word Lhan was used.
I love that. The word Susa, which just means like a region, a sphere of occupation, was still used in Gondor. There's a piece of the common speech still used. Oh, we're going to go to the various, whatever the plural. We're going to go take a look at the northern Susa of Anorian. That word was still there, and the Shire just turns it into, using the definite article instead of the Susa. It's Suzat. Right, that's what the T at the end means.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that relates nicely to what it's referred to as in The Hobbit, because it's not called the Shire in The Hobbit.
No.
It's just referred to as the country, our land, basically, the land.
Yeah, because that's how hobbits refer to things, the water, the hill,
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, we don't get the name of Shire until the Lord of the Rings. Speaking of things we also don't get, I don't think, until the Lord of the Rings, and it's the idea of the farthings. I think that's not in The Hobbit. I may be wrong, so I'm willing to be proven that way. But we get an explanation of farthing in F2 that I really like here. He says, similarly, farthing has been used for the 4 divisions of the Shire, because the Hobbit word tharni was an old word for quarter, seldom used in ordinary language, where the word for quarter was tharantin, 4th part. In Gondor, tharni was used for a silver coin, the 4th part of the kastar. In Noldorin, the kanath, or 4th part of the mirian. So just like farthing is also currency in the real world, Tolkien translated that.
Yep.
I mean, I love how in-depth he goes on this. It's just so nerdy. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Now, these Hobbit place names, where Tolkien says, seldom difficult to translate in this way, because their names were made up from elements that we would also use in simple English place names, places ending in hill, field, ton for town, etc.
Yeah.
And for place names that came from words no longer in use, Tolkien used English words that also had archaic origins. Witch, bottle for dwelling, or Mitchell, great.
I love that. I mean, just, like, all right, this element in common speech is archaic. It's a word that's no longer used except in this place name. So I'm going to use an archaic English element. It just, again, representing every little aspect of the common speech in English somehow. But of course, the technique had to be modified for surnames, last names, since names were inherited and often centuries old. A lot of them had origins as jesting nicknames, but then they stuck around, or as names of plants and trees, which of course is very Hobbit-like.
He says these weren't hard to translate, but he hints at more difficulty for names that had forgotten meaning. And those he didn't so much as translate as anglicize the spelling, took as an example.
Yeah. Now, if you think we're content with that, you're wrong. Not when we have the draft of F2 available to us, where he writes that the personal names of the hobbits were much more awkward to manage. And he goes on, rightly or wrongly, I have attempted to translate these also into English terms or to substitute equivalents wherever possible. Many of the family names have more or less obvious meanings in the common speech, such as Goodenough. By the way, I love that there was a name Goodenough. We didn't get that in the finished version of The Lord of the Rings. There's nobody named Goodenough.
Clearly,
what a great name. Yeah, exactly. He goes on with other names, Bracegirdle, Proudfoot, Burrows, and the like. And these can fairly be treated in the same way as the place names.
Now, no one's going to argue with the idea that if a guy's name is supposed to mean to his peers Hornblower, then it's better to simply call him Hornblower, even if his name in Westron was Rasputa, a meaningless sound form.
Yeah. The problem with that, though, is it brings us to this unique situation of mixing and matching. As Tolkien writes, if a large part of the names are thus anglicized, the rest must be made to fit, for a mixture of English and alien names would give a wholly false impression.
And I want to remember that quote when we come to the mailbag question.
Yes.
Because it's such an important thing that turns out to kind of have some interesting implications for translating to languages other than English. But anyway, coming back to Tolkien's translation into English, it's the borderline cases that are problematic, as you said, right? One of these is Baggins, which is actually in Hobbit or common speech, Labingi. Tolkien explains, it is by no means certain that this name is really connected with the common speech Laban, a bag. But it was believed to be so, and one may compare Laban Neck, bag end, as the name of the residents of Bungo Baggins, Bunga Labingi. That's why, Tolkien explains, he translates Labingi as Baggins, saying that he thinks it gives a very close equivalent in readily appreciable modern terms.
It also gives an opportunity for some really good word nerdery and play on things like the end of a bag, and when he has the conversation with Smaug and the Hobbits, or jokes with the Sackville Bagginses because of a sack in a bag, and I mean it's just all sorts of other fun things.
Absolutely.
Another troublesome name that Tolkien says was Tuc, T-U-C. He says that according to Tuc traditions, Tuca was an archaic word meaning daring. Quote, but this appears to be a wholly unfounded guess, and I have in this case been content with anglicization of the form to Tuc.
What I find fascinating about both that and the belief that Labingi has something to do with a bag. It ties in with a very real world phenomenon, which is people come up with these folk etymologies all the time of what their name means and so on, and they don't always get it right. But it becomes part of their identity.
It's made up.
Exactly.
It's just made up from whole cloth. Yeah. But hey, that's okay. The whole cloth makes a bag. So, yeah.
But let's move on now to see how he dealt with given or first names.
All right. I have treated Hobbit first names, as far as possible, in the same way. To their maid children, Hobbits commonly gave the names of flowers or jewels. To their man children, they usually gave names that had no meaning at all in their daily language, and some of their women's names were similar. Of this kind are Bilbo, Bungo, Polo, Lotho, Tanta, Nina, and so on. There are many inevitable but accidental resemblances to names we now have or know. For instance, Otho, Odo, Drogo, Dora, Cora, and the like. These names I have retained, though I have usually anglicized them by altering their endings, since in Hobbit names, A was a masculine ending, and O and E were feminine. In some old families, especially those of fallowhide origin, such as the Tooks and the Bolgers, it was, however, the custom to give high-sounding first names. Since most of these seem to have been drawn from legends of the past, of men as well as of hobbits, and many, while now meaningless to hobbits, closely resembled the names of men in the Vale of Anduin or in Dale or in the Mark, I have turned them into those old names, largely of Frankish and Gothic origin, that are still used by us or are met in our histories. I have thus, at any rate, preserved the often comic contrast between the first names and surnames, of which the hobbits themselves were well aware. Names of classical origin have rarely been used, for the nearest equivalents to Latin and Greek in Shire lore were the Elvish tongues, and these the hobbits seldom used in nomenclature. Few of them at any time knew the languages of the kings, as they called them. The names of the Bucklanders were different from those of the rest of the Shire. The folk of the Marish and their offshoot across the Brandywine were in many ways peculiar, as has been told. It was from the former language of the southern Stewards, no doubt, that they inherited many of their very odd names. These I have usually left unaltered, for if queer now, they were queer in their own day. They had a style that we should perhaps feel vaguely to be Celtic. Since the survival of traces of the older language of the Stewards and the Bree men resembled the survival of Celtic elements in England, I've sometimes imitated the latter in my translation. Thus, Bree, Coombe, Archet, and Chetwood are modeled on relics of British nomenclature. Chosen according to sense: Bree, hill; Chet, wood. But only one personal name has been altered in this way. Meriadoc was chosen to fit the fact that this character's shortened name, Callie, meant in the Westron jolly, gay, though it was actually an abbreviation of the now unmeaning Buckland name, Kalimak. I have not used names of Hebraic or similar origin in my transpositions. Nothing in Hobbit names corresponds to this element in our names. Short names such as Sam, Tom, Tim, Matt were common as abbreviations of actual Hobbit names such as Tomba, Tolma, Mata, and the like. But Sam and his father Ham were really called Ban and Ran. These were shortenings of Banazir and Ranugad, originally nicknames meaning half-wise, simple, and stay at home. But being words that had fallen out of colloquial use, they remained as traditional names in certain families. I have therefore tried to preserve these features by using Samwise and Hamfast, modernizations of ancient English Samwis and Hamfest, which corresponded closely in meaning. So much there. So much to unpack. I mean,
so
really.
Again, this meticulous work,
so detailed.
that
I know
he did, which we'll get to. So we've now gotten to the fun and often funny Hobbit first names, which Tolkien says he tried to treat in the same way. Yeah. That is, translation by sense when possible, and simple anglicization of the names when there is no sense to translate.
Then we're reminded that girls are often given flower or jewel names. Think marigold, daisy, ruby, and the like. And Tolkien gives us a fun example in F2, explaining, I have translated Hamanulus by Lobelia, because although I do not know precisely what flower is intended, Hamanulus appears to have been usually small and blue and cultivated in gardens, and the word seems to have been a gardener's rather than a popular name.
I love the fact that he constructs that whole invented reason for
Yes.
it as well.
I know. It's fantastic. And for a name, I mean, this doesn't even make it out of F2. Like,
Right. Boys, on the other hand, were often given names that had no meaning at all, literal nonsense names. And some girls had the misfortune of receiving similar names. We're given examples of these nonsense names, including Bilbo and Bungo, as well as examples of names that Tolkien said bear an accidental resemblance to names we know.
First off, then, do we believe him that they are accidentally resembling real-world names?
Is this another retcon?
That's what I'm thinking. I don't think this is accidental.
Exactly. Why are the trolls called William and
Bert, and Tom?
Yeah.
No, we do not believe him. Second, the names that he gives as like accidentally resembling real world names aren't exactly commonplace. And let's be honest, I have never known a Drogo in real life. I know it's a real name, but I've never known anybody named Drogo. And the only Dora I know of was an Explorer. But does anybody remember Odo from Deep Space Nine?
Yeah, absolutely.
Rene Auberjonois.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, again, nobody really knows Drogos or Odos.
Right.
I mean, maybe Cora. Cora might be the only name that I think I've met
true.
Somebody named Cora.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Yep. But so it's interesting. They're real names. Only the ending has changed, which does happen a lot when when words get moved from one language to another. Tolkien explains that when the Hobbit name was similar to a real world name like this, he anglicized the ending because male names ended in A and female names ended in O and E.
Now, wait just a second. Bilbo, Frodo, these end in O, not A. But those also aren't the names that bear accidental resemblances to real world names. So that's what he's talking about there is these names that represent or that bear accidental resemblance had to get changed.
Yes. Plus he's talking about the names in common speech.
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah.
Hobbits would speak. He anglicizes Otho and Odo with the O because that makes it male in English.
Right.
With Dora and Cora ending in A to symbolize the feminine nature of those names. Their real Hobbit names were different.
That's true. And then he throws all this out the window for old families, especially those of Fallowhide origin like the Tooks. For them, it was all about giving these high-sounding first names like Paladin and Peregrine, drawn from Mannish and Hobbit legends.
And since these would often be of men from the Vales of Anduin or Dale, or even the Mark, Tolkien has translated those names by sense as well, using words that similarly relate to English, words with Gothic and Frankish origins. This also maintains what Tolkien says is the often comic contrast between their first and last names, like Peregrine Took, for example.
Exactly. Fancy sounding first name, Took. Yeah. So he also explains why he uses Gothic and Frankish names rather than, say, Latin or Greek names. Those latter two, Latin or Greek, would be more comparable to the Elvish tongues. We know especially, right? Like we've talked at length about Quenya being the Elvish Latin. Hobbits just didn't use those words in naming people or places, and it may likely be because so few of them spoke any of the languages of the kings.
Exactly. Yeah. There's one more exception. The hobbits who lived in the Buckland, on the other side of the Brandywine from the rest of the Shire, this would primarily be the Brandybucks and their kin, folk there and those in the Marish are considered peculiar by the rest of the hobbits in the Shire. We read that from the quote before. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right again in the old forest. That's a dark and dangerous place. Yeah. Now, these names Tolkien has typically left unchanged because, after all, they were strange to the rest of the hobbits. Again, trying to preserve that hobbit point of view. So they should also be strange to us, though he does add that they should have a vaguely Celtic feel. What does that mean? James, help me with that, Mr. Language Man.
Well, I think we do associate certain words as sounding. The examples he gives of, I think comb was one of the examples and so on, and Chetwood and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think we have an intuitive sense.
Yeah.
You would hear, I mean, if you think about people in the US, for example, probably have an intuitive sense when they come across a place name that's of Native American origin.
Oh, yeah. Yosemite.
Right? You can just sort of say, oh, that's probably Massachusetts or something like that, right? And so it's the same sort of thing, right? That I think you intuitively pick up, even if you're not a historical linguist, that there are certain regions of Britain where the place names sound more Celtic, or they sound more Danish, or they sound more.
So maybe somebody who's a native who lives in the UK would pick up on that distinction a lot more than somebody here in the States.
I'd say so.
That makes sense. Yeah. I would understand that.
Speaking of Celtic origins, Tolkien draws an analogy since the older language of the Stoors in the Marish and Buckland and the language of the men of Bree, which was distantly connected with Dunlendish initially,
That's right.
resembled the survival of Celtic elements in England. He's gone for something similar. And again, as I said before, Bree is an example, Combe, Archet, Chetwood. They're all based on Old British names, translated again by sense.
Okay, surviving Celtic elements, right. And he's done that almost exclusively with place names, but he says that he has done it with one singular first name, Meriadoc or Meriadic. Where should I be putting the stress on that, Mr.
We're not
Linguist?
told because it's a Hobbit name. We're not told how stress works.
It doesn't fit in the rules of pronunciation.
Well, also, I mean, it's not even this is his translated name anyway. It's an English name.
It's not his Westron
so
name.
it would follow the rules of English stress.
Yeah. So the shortened version of his real common speech name, which is Kali, that's the shortened version, meant jolly or gay, even though it was just an abbreviation of a meaningless Buckland name, Kalimak. So Kalimak didn't necessarily mean anything related to jolly or gay, but because Kalimak got shortened to Kali and Kali had a meaning of jolly or gay, Mary ended up being the shortened version of Meriadoc.
Exactly. Or put the other way, he constructed Meriadoc to be a name that could be shortened
to Mary. Right.
So the short version would have the same meaning as the short version of Kalimak.
That makes more sense, right? He starts with the shortened version because he would have been called Kali all the time anyway. Nobody would have bothered calling him Kalimak most of the time.
Right.
Except for maybe his mother when he was in trouble.
Yeah, and presumably he avoided the double M. So if he just copied over the muck bit and translated Kalimak to Mary Muck, there's a river. In the US, but he altered it slightly. But the idea is to match the meaning of the short words,
the connection, right?
The full
because the long name doesn't have a meaning; it's now meaningless.
Exactly, right. Before we move on to Sam's name, I did want to add a bit from the draft F2 that's useful here. Tolkien admits that what he did with Hobbit names entails, of course, far-reaching alteration of the actual phonetic forms. But he feels it's just as legitimate as the hornblower example he gave earlier.
Absolutely. Or switching to the bigger picture, indeed, than translating the dialogue of the Red Book into English, whereby naturally its true sound is changed and many of its verbal points are obscured. But he adds he's done all this work, quote, with some care, pointing out the fondness of families for runs of similar names or of fathers for giving to their sons names that either alliterated with their own or had a similar ending has been duly represented. And one look at the family trees of the Shire will show you that.
Right, exactly. It's interesting that so his overriding feature is the sense, translating the sense over.
Yeah.
But it was also important for him to bring across certain characteristics of it, even though in many cases the actual phonetics has changed. He wants to still capture things like the alliteration of names and so on.
What's crazy is that he's not actually translating a language. He's translating another language that he created. Again, we're talking about this like he's actually translating a real language. And it's like, I keep coming back to the idea that you don't have to do that, but he did. It's really amazing.
Yeah. Finally, Tolkien explains that he hasn't used anything connected with Hebraic names and that names that might seem to suggest otherwise, Sam, Tom, Tim, Matt, are simply abbreviations of actual Hobbit names. Mm-hmm. Then we get to the really cool story about Sam's name and his father's name.
Love this.
Sam was actually Ban, short for Banazir, and Ham was actually Ran, short for Ranogad.
But those names, which were originally, long time ago, nicknames, had meanings as nicknames. Banazir meant half-wise, simple, while Ranugad meant stay at home. Now, the nickname aspect over time lost its meaning. They just became traditional names, but without meaning over the years or even centuries.
But Tolkien tried to preserve this unusual history of an old nickname, once defined, now meaningless, with the names of Samwise and Hamfast, which themselves are modern versions of the Old English names Samvius and Harmfast, which carry those same original meanings of half-wise or simple and stay at home.
And that, especially Sam's name, brings me back to the epilogue and the king's letter that Elessar wrote. In it, he said that he desires to greet there all his friends. In especial, he desires to see Master Samwise, mayor of the Shire, and Rose, his wife. But in the Sindarin, he included Sam's name in Sindarin, Perhail, meaning half-wise, but he adds this parenthetical. I sen nui panthael estathar ayin, which translates as who ought to be called full wise. I love that. Lesar translating the common speech, which was, of course, Banazir, into Sindarin as Perhail, and saying, you shouldn't be Perhail, you should be Panthail. You should be full wise. I just love that little, it's just a tiny little thing. And of course, we don't see it because, again, the King's Letter, which was part of the epilogue, didn't make it in. But folks, that epilogue is fantastic, worth reading. And Dawn and I did a couple episodes to start season 9 on it. So go back to those. In the meantime, we want to move on to sort of the predecessor to this, right? We've talked about English representing common speech, but what about its ancestral tongues? One of those is that of Rohan. James, would you read about what Tolkien did for translating the language of Rohan?
Having gone so far in my attempt to modernize and make familiar the language and names of hobbits, I found myself involved in a further process. The Mannish languages that were related to the Westron should, it seemed to me, be turned into forms related to English. The language of Rohan I have accordingly made to resemble ancient English, since it was related both more distantly to the common speech and very closely to the former tongue of the northern hobbits, and was in comparison with the Westron archaic. In the Red Book, it is noted in several places that when hobbits heard the speech of Rohan, they recognised many words and felt the language to be akin to their own, so that it seemed absurd to leave the recorded names and words of the Rohirrim in a wholly alien style. In several cases, I have modernised the forms and spelling of place names in Rohan, as in Dunharrow or Snowbourne, but I have not been consistent, for I have followed the hobbits. They altered the names that they heard in the same way. If they were made of elements that they recognised, or if they resembled place names in the Shire, but many they left alone, as I have done, for instance in Edoras, the courts. For the same reasons, a few personal names have been modernised as Shadowfax and Wormtongue. This assimilation also provided a convenient way of representing the peculiar local hobbit words that were of northern origin. They have been given in the forms that lost English words might well have had if they had come down to our day. Thus, Matham is meant to recall ancient English Martham, and so to represent the relationship of the actual hobbit cast to Rohanese Castu. Similarly, Smile, or Smile, Burrow, is a likely form for a descendant of Smeagol, and represents well the relationship of hobbit Tran to Rohanese Trahan. Smeagol and Deagle are equivalents made up in the same way for the names Trahald, burrowing, worming in, and Narhald, secret, in the northern tongues.
I love that. We finally get that in-depth explanation of the connection between Rohan's language, represented by Old English in the text, as we kept talking about last week, Rohan representative,
yes,
and the common speech represented by modern English. And Tolkien starts by acknowledging that any language of men related to the Westron should be turned into forms related to English.
And again, this is going to come up in our mailbag question.
Yeah.
But the Rohan's language, therefore, resembles ancient English, with Tolkien pointing out that it was related both more distantly to the common speech and very closely to the former tongue of the northern hobbits, and was in comparison with the Westron archaic. Since, after all, we've seen a few places where the hobbits recognised many words and felt Rohirric to be akin to their own language, Tolkien argues it seemed absurd to leave the recorded names and words of the Rohirrim in a wholly alien style.
Seems absurd indeed. It's interesting because this whole conceit of I'm translating all of this into English, which of course he has to do. He's a philologist. He knows that these ancient peoples weren't speaking English the way we speak it today. But all of this has led Tolkien to have to do a ton of extra work to all these other languages that are connected. Is it any wonder that authors don't address this particular aspect of world building?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to do a conlang. It's another thing to say I'm translating all of this into English, and therefore I'm translating all these other things.
Right.
That's a ton of work.
Yes, exactly.
This is wild.
Exactly. Yeah. He does concede that he's modernized the spellings of place names, but not consistently. And the lack of consistency was completely on purpose.
That is wild. I mean, part of me thinks that's an excuse, and then I realize, no, he's doing this intentionally for
from
a
the
reason.
Hobbits. Yeah, and it all comes
hobbits.
down to the Hobbit's point of view, right? Because the Hobbits altered names the same way,
Yeah.
inconsistently, or sometimes left them alone. He's done the same, right? The same rule applies to names like Shadowfax and Wormtongue.
Yeah, that's really amazing. We do get a very important footnote here. Because of the Old English connection, a lot of readers, and I was guilty of this at first, sort of assume the Rohirrim are basically Anglo-Saxons on horseback. I mean, I kind of, it's an easy reduction to make, an easy mistake to make. But Tolkien explains that this translation choice that he's made doesn't reflect at all on the nature of the Rohirrim. The footnote reads, this linguistic procedure does not imply that the Rohirrim closely resembled the ancient English otherwise, in culture or art, in weapons or modes of warfare, except in a general way due to their circumstances, a simpler and more primitive people living in contact with a higher and more venerable culture and occupying lands that had once been part of its domain.
I think it's really interesting that he takes the time to point out this potential misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Even though it's a misunderstanding that he would not have seen yet, but has perpetuated since.
It absolutely has. He
all
sort
the way
of,
through to the
foresight,
Peter Jackson movies
absolutely.
and everything.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that he was at pains to point out, don't assume that the culture and art carries over as well. This is just a linguistic analogy, not a cultural analogy.
Right. And I also like that he carries that into like what they do have in common with the Anglo-Saxons, that they are a simpler, more primitive people living in contact with the Gondorians, in this case, the higher and more venerable culture. And I don't think I've ever thought of this before, occupying lands that had once been part of its domain, sort of going back to this idea of the Roman Empire.
Yes.
I love that because I never made that connection.
Yep.
And it's like, wait a minute, the Anglo-Saxons living in lands that had once been part of the Roman Empire, just as the Rohirrim are living in lands that were once part of Gondor. Really cool. Absolutely love that.
In F2, we actually get a glimpse at real Rohirric. First, Tolkien explains that he only used compound names like Eomer and Halifirian when the originals in Rohirric were also compound. And that's when he explains that the element Eo, which so often appears, not unnaturally, being an old word meaning horse among people devoted to horses, represents an element loho, low of the same sense. Thus, Eotheod, horsefolk or horseland, translates lotur. Theoden, as many of the other royal names, is an old word for king corresponding to Rohan Turak.
That whole sidebar on the language of the men of Rohan gives Tolkien a chance to explain what he calls the peculiar local Hobbit words that were of northern origin. And this is where his philological sense really comes into play, because he gives these words the forms that lost English words might well have had if they'd survived into modern English.
It reminds me of his comment about dwarves.
Well,
right?
yeah, and that's why he ends up talking about the dwarves, doesn't he?
Exactly, right? That he when he brings up Dwarrows as how it would have been had it continued. He actually does that.
Yeah.
With Matham. It's meant to seem like the Old English Matham, and that this connection between the two reflects the actual connection between Rohirric custu and the Hobbit word cust. So again, it's this analogy. What would it have been like for hobbits? Giving us that perspective.
Basically, that's why for us, like, what do we hear when we hear Old English? Words that have some slight, sometimes a similarity and a connection, but not very often. And, you know, this isn't like Middle English, which I almost wonder, like, would he have had another group of people speaking a language in between that he could have represented with Middle English? Would have been interesting. I don't know. Yeah. So this is also where we get the amazing connection between smile, right, the word for a hobbit hole or burrow, and smigel, the Old English word for burrow, a place to creep into, and how this represents a connection between Rohirric Trahan and Hobbit Tron.
And finally, Smeagol and Deagle are equivalents for Trahald, which meant burrowing, worming in, and Nahald, meaning secret, in the old northern tongues from which Rohirric is descended.
I love that. It's so much detail and so much explanation, all totally unnecessary, but absolutely welcomed by word nerds like us. Folks, if you're enjoying the PPP, please consider supporting the show by joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. That gives me the time and resources that I need to work on making this show the best that it can be. And when you join, you become part of an amazing Discord community. You get live episode recordings, Discord hangouts every month. You get episode postscripts. You can get ad-free episodes, free merch, and more.
You can also become part of our Questions After Nightfall episodes, or even join us as a guest in the North Wing. So please go to patreon.com/prancingponypod to show your support and join the Fellowship of the Podcast.
And of course, you can always help us out by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify. And please recommend us to your friends.
Okay, now let's move on to some more retconning and dealing with the language of the dwarves and the men of the Dale.
The still more northerly language of Dale is in this book seen only in the names of the dwarves that came from that region, and so used the language of the men there, taking their outer names in that tongue. It may be observed that in this book, as in The Hobbit, the form dwarves is used, although the dictionaries tell us that the plural of dwarf is dwarfs. It should be dwaros, or dweros, if singular and plural had each gone its own way down the years, as have man and men, or goose and geese. But we no longer speak of a dwarf as often as we do of a man, or even of a goose, and memories have not been fresh enough among men to keep hold of a special plural for a race now abandoned to folk tales, where at least a shadow of truth is preserved, or at least to nonsense stories in which they have become mere figures of fun. But in the Third Age, something of their old character and power is still glimpsed, if already a little dimmed. These are the descendants of the Naugrim of the elder days, in whose hearts still burns the ancient fire of Aule the smith, and the embers smolder of their long grudge against the elves, and in whose hands still lives the skill in work of stone that none have surpassed. It is to mark this that I have ventured to use the form dwarves, and remove them a little, perhaps, from the sillier tales of these latter days. Dwaros would have been better, but I have used that form only in the name Dwarodelf to represent the name of Moria in the common speech, Furunargian. For that meant dwarf delving, and yet was already a word of antique form. But Moria is an elvish name, and given without love. For the Eldar, though they might at need, in their bitter wars with the Dark Power and his servants, contrive fortresses underground, were not dwellers in such places of choice. They were lovers of the green earth and the lights of heaven, and Moria in their tongue means the black chasm. But the dwarves themselves, and this name at least was never kept secret, called it Khazad-dûm, the mansion of the Khazad, for such is their own name for their own race, and has been so since Aule gave it to them at their making in the deeps of time.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So a really short section here on the language of the men of Dale. After all, its only examples are seen in the Dwarvish names, like Thorin, Dwalin, Glóin. Mm-hmm. But it's also where we get that explanation we just mentioned earlier, the fact that the word dwarves is an intentional choice as opposed to the dictionary plural of dwarfs. And again,
something you had to explain to the typesetter, if I remember correctly.
Exactly.
Like, don't fix what I meant there on purpose.
Although he does, in a letter, I believe, admit that it was just a mistake on his part. So when he says,
that.
Yeah, he does say that it was a lapse in grammar. So I think this was a little bit of retconning.
More retconning. I love it. Tolkien says he would rather have used the word dwaros or dweros because that's the form the plural would have taken. He says if singular and plural had each gone its own way down the years. And he compares the man and men and goose and geese.
I just have to point out, just very briefly, that same phenomenon is what we see in Sindarin. If you look at Sindarin plurals and the fact that the plural of Amon becomes Emin, and Orod becomes Erid, and so on, that's exactly the same process.
Yeah, where the vowels change. Yeah,
exactly. That vowel shift, that I mutation or umlaut, as Jakob Grimm called it, is what's going on in
pretty amazing.
Men, and dwaros, but it's also what happens in Sindarin. But apparently, as much as geese annoy us, we do talk about them more than dwarves because Tolkien makes the point, and this is, again, a fantastic lesson in historical linguistics.
Isn't it?
We no longer speak of a dwarf as often as we do of a man or of a goose, and memories have not been fresh enough for men to keep hold of a special plural for a race now abandoned to folk tales where at least a shadow of truth is preserved. And we see this historically, where words are constantly used, they become a lot more robust.
Yes.
And so we get more archaic grammar as a result. When words only become regularized when they become less frequent, which is why we get most of the exceptions in English only happen in the common words because we use them so often.
So much that they get their own forms.
I love the fact that Tolkien gives us this little lesson in historical linguistics.
I know. He's always teaching us something. From here, though, I have to say Tolkien goes on a dwarf tangent, pointing out that these are a mighty people. We get a glimpse here of their old character and power. And I got to say, this passage makes me love the dwarves a bit more, and it's worth reading it a second time. This is amazing, right?
Did a dwarf write this?
That's the thing. It does feel very dwarf, like we talked about last week with Galadriel.
Interpolation, yes.
The scribe, there's a dwarven scribe going, well, I've got to stick something in here. This is so ridiculous. These stupid men, they don't know what they're writing about. Let me put this in. Descendants of the Naugrim of the elder days, in whose hearts still burns the ancient fire of Aure the smith, and the embers smolder of their long grudge against the elves, and in whose hands still lives the skill and work of stone that none have surpassed. And here's your pen back. I'm done. I mean, it's killer prose for being buried in the appendix.
Yeah.
It's just gorgeous, really florid and rich and just like, ooh, I like the dwarves now. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny that, this ancient mighty race, Tolkien wants to distinguish these from the, quote, sillier tales of these latter days, which, to be honest, he wants to do with elves too. Arguably just about everyone.
That's true. Lift everybody up from this silliness of today. We also get a really cool explanation of the names of Moria. Now, Tolkien might not have been able to get away with calling them Dwaros in the text, but he did manage to get that theoretical plural in for the name Dwaro-Delph, which means dwarf delving, along with its common speech name, the word that it was translated from, which is Furunargian.
And the explanation that Moria is, as we've talked about often before, an elvish name. Pretty sure the dwarves wouldn't call their mansions Black Chasm.
No, I don't think they would.
It's a lack of understanding, really. Elves just don't get the underground lifestyle.
No, they just really like the green earth and the sun and all of that, except for Thingol. He seemed to be pretty happy in Menegroth. I mean, I know that's covered under the part of how sometimes they had to do this in their time.
Finrod?
Conflict, but
Finrod must have been okay with it to a certain extent.
He was, Hewer of caves, right? Now, the dwarves, of course, they rightly call it Khazad-dûm, the mansion of the Khazad. They're not going to call it, right, the subdivision of the Khazad. This is a mansion, for crying out loud. I also thought this was interesting. These two mentions of Aule here, right, the ancient fire of Aule that still burns in their hearts, and that Aule is said to have given them the name Khazad. These are the first and only times that Aule is mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, and that sort of went off on a tangent and was like, let's take a look at mentions of Valar in The Lord of the Rings. I mean, other than Varda, who gets a lot of mention as either Varda or mostly as Elbereth.
Yep.
We don't get a lot.
That's really it. I mean, it's, Yavanna doesn't get a mention. Manwë doesn't get a mention, of all people.
It's because there's no Vanyar writing this. OMG Manwë. Yeah, we get the one mention of Orome where Theoden is compared to him, and it's one of my favorite bits in the text. We don't get an Ulmo sighting. We don't get a Mandos sighting. We don't get anything.
Nope.
But we do get Aule twice, which is interesting.
Yes. It's the dwarvish interpolation here.
I think you're right. I'm beginning to suspect.
Gotta get Aule in somewhere.
I gotta get this in here. Let me get the chisel and start fixing this. All right. Well, he did want to raise the dwarves up from the silliness of, today's stories. He also wanted to do that with the elves. James, would you go ahead and read the kind of short passage here on the translation of elf stuff?
Absolutely. Elves has been used to translate both Quendi, the speakers, the high elven name of all their kind, and Eldar, the name of the three kindreds that sought for the undying realm and came there at the beginning of days, save the Sindar only. This old word was indeed the only one available, and was once fitted to apply to such memories of this people as men preserved, or to the making of men's minds not wholly dissimilar. But it has been diminished, and to many it may now suggest fancies either pretty or silly, as unlike to the Quendi of old as are butterflies to the swift falcon. Not that any of the Quendi ever possessed wings of the body, as unnatural to them as to men. They were a race high and beautiful, the older children of the world, and among them the Eldar were as kings, who now are gone. The people of the great journey, the people of the stars. They were tall, fair of skin and grey-eyed, though their locks were dark, save in the golden house of Finarfin, and their voices had more melodies than any mortal voice that now is heard. They were valiant, but the history of those that returned to Middle-earth in exile was grievous. And though it was in far-off days crossed by the fate of the fathers, their fate is not that of men. Their dominion passed long ago, and they dwell now beyond the circles of the world, and do not return.
And like so many things about the elves, it always ends with a touch of sadness, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
So we get another short section. This time it's on the elves. A word that Tolkien says has been used to translate two Eldarin words. Quendi, which means the speakers. We talked about that earlier. That's the Quenya name for the entire race. But also Eldar, the name applied only to the three kindreds that began the journey to Valinor. Now, there's a parenthetical here that says, save the Sindar only. That applies to the line right before it, the one, and came there, talking about Valinor, at the beginning of days. The Sindar are still Eldar. They're just not Calaquendi, right? They never saw the trees.
The trees, yeah. Tolkien seems to excuse his use of the word, saying it was indeed the only one available, before launching into a defense of the elf from modern interpretation, similar to how we just read.
Exactly.
He argued about the dwarves and the modern silliness, suggesting that the word elves now suggest fancies, either pretty or silly, saying that these are as different to actual elves, quote, as are butterflies to the swift falcon.
I love how he has to insert, by the way, not that elves had any wings.
Just to clarify.
Yeah, or Balrogs for that matter. That's the footnote, the unpublished footnote, yeah.
but then we get this, propaganda interpolation again. The elves, all of them were a race high and beautiful, and the Eldar, those who started the journey west, were as kings among the other elves.
Some Eldar wrote that. Yeah.
Yes.
We get some really clear physical descriptions, but Christopher has some clarifications, shall we say. First, tall, fair of skin with gray eyes and dark hair. I do want to point out, whether we're comfortable with this or not, this is not Tolkien using fair as a way to describe somebody's beauty, as he sometimes does, where we are still left guessing as to skin tone. He is actually saying fair of skin. So he's describing these elves as fair skin.
And having dark hair.
Oh, yeah, and gray eyes and dark hair, of course. And that's relevant because of the exceptions.
Yes, he gives the exception of the house of Finarfin, which, the father of Finrod and Galadriel, among others.
Mm-hmm.
But Christopher explains by reference to an earlier draft that this really only applies to the description of the Noldor, not all the Eldar.
And that makes sense. You'll totally understand when you listen to Christopher's argument here, Christopher's point. Now, in the earliest draft, which is labeled F***, this was back when Tolkien wanted to include this as part of the prologue rather than as an appendix. Tolkien is writing specifically about the Noldor, pointing out that he sometimes left the word gnome or gnomish to describe them because the name of the Noldor signifies those who know. Now, after all, the Noldor were set apart because, as Tolkien puts it, their knowledge of things that are and were in this world and by their desire to know more. So, gnomish.
Then he distinguishes these gnomes, or Noldor, from the gnomes of popular fancy in a very similar way, almost identical to the way he describes Eldar as different from the fancies, either pretty or silly. Later, even though Tolkien eliminated the use of gnome or gnomish from Lord of the Rings, he still kept this passage, but changed its application, applying it to elves.
Now, Christopher points out that he addresses this all the way back in Book of Lost Tales 1, the very first volume of History of Middle-earth, when he pointed out that this passage about eye color and hair color was written, quote, of the Noldor only. So after all, he writes in Peoples of Middle-earth here, quoting himself from Book of Lost Tales 1, I objected that the Vanyar had golden hair, and it was from Finarfin's Vanyarin mother Indis that he and Finrod Felagund and Galadriel, his children, had their golden hair, finding in the final use of this passage an extraordinary perversion of meaning. But my father carefully remodeled the passage in order to apply it to the Eldar as a whole, and it does indeed seem extraordinary that he should have failed to observe this point. It seems possible that when he reused the passage in this way, the conception of the golden hair of the Vanyar had not yet arisen. So he's trying to, look, this doesn't make any sense, Dad. You completely, you forgot about the whole point is that it's the Vanyarin blood through Indis that gives the house of Finrod or of Finarfin, the golden hair. So how in the world, but you did redo this passage. You didn't just change Noldor to elves. You changed other things. So you clearly took the time to tweak this But it still doesn't make any sense unless maybe at that point you hadn't decided about the Vanyar.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's the reason. I don't know. I don't know. There's no real clear cut answer here. We do know, though, that obviously the Vanyar have golden hair as well.
Yep. But whatever their hair color or eye color, they had melodic voice and were valiant, we're told.
So clearly not related to you and me, James.
Speak for yourself, Al. We have melodic voices. Surely that could be... maybe not valiant.
I was going to say they were valiant. It wasn't like
valiant. Yes,
were valiant. You know, you must have both a melodic voice and valiance. All right.
Well, people don't listen to the podcast to hear us be valiant. So
well, that's a good thing. Yeah. We listened a long time.
It's the low, melodious voices.
That's right.
We get a reference to the mingling of the elves and men. The history of the exiles was in far-off days crossed by the fate of the fathers, and a reminder that their fate is different.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Their dominion has long ago passed, and they are no longer present in the circles of the world.
Again, that sort of melancholy, that sense of fading and disappearing, and in this case, disappeared. You know, they're not just fading; they are gone. They're no longer present here in the world, and that's a sorrowful thing. That their only presence is felt in the bloodlines of men.
Yep.
That they, the three unions of the Eldar and the Edain.
Yeah. Okay, let's finish up Appendix F by coming back to the word Hobbit itself, as well as some other thoughts on Hobbit names.
All right. Hobbit is an invention. In the Westron, the word used when this people was referred to at all was Banakil, halfling. But at this date, the folk of the Shire and of Bree used the word Kuduk, which was not found elsewhere. Meriadoc, however, actually records that the king of Rohan used the word Kudukan, hole dweller. Since, as has been noted, the hobbits had once spoken a language closely related to that of the Rohirrim, it seems likely that Kuduk was a worn-down form of Kudukan. The latter I have translated for reasons explained by Holbitla, and Hobbit provides a word that might well be a worn-down form of Holbitla, if that name had occurred in our own ancient language. Gamgee. According to family tradition set out in the Red Book, the surname Galbasi, or in reduced form Galpsi, came from the village of Galabas, popularly supposed to be derived from Galab, game, and an old element bas, more or less equivalent to our wick or witch. Gamwich, I pronounced it that way because that's how it's spelled, but then he puts in parentheses pronounced gamage, so that's how we pronounce gamage. It looks like Gamwich. Seemed therefore a very fair rendering. However, in reducing Gamagee to Gamgee to represent Galpsy, no reference was intended to the connection of Samwise with the family of Cotton, though a jest of that kind would have been Hobbit-like enough had there been any warrant in their language. And boy, will we get to that. Because I'm like, what? What do you mean? What connection? What? Anyway, sorry, back to the text. Cotton, in fact, Tolkien goes on, represents Hlothron, a fairly common village name in the Shire derived from Hloth, a two-roomed dwelling or hole, and Ran, or Ranu, a small group of such dwellings on a hillside. As a surname, it may be an alteration of Hlothrama, cottager. Hlothram, which I have rendered Cotman, was the name of Farmer Cotton's grandfather. Brandywine. The Hobbit names of this river were alterations of the Elvish Branduin. And then he puts in parentheses accented on and. Derived from Baran, golden brown, and Duin, large river. Of Branduin, Brandywine seemed a natural corruption in modern times. Actually, the older Hobbit name was Brandanin, border water, which would have been more closely rendered by Marchborn. But by a jest that had become habitual, referring again to its color, at this time the river was usually called Braldahim, heady ale. It must be observed, however, that when the old bucks, Zaragamba, changed their name to Brandybuck, Brandagamba, the first element meant borderland, and Marchbuck would have been nearer. Only a very bold hobbit would have ventured to call the master of Buckland Braldagamba in his hearing. And we'll get to why this, wait a minute, such a classic Tolkien way to end the entire thing.
Oh yeah, indeed. There's more to say about this.
Yes, there is.
I want to start by saying that we'll try to address the other Hobbit names that Tolkien goes in depth on in F2 when we release the mega P5 for these appendix episodes.
Yeah. There are a lot more names, by the way, in there.
Oh, yeah.
A lot. I don't know if we can cover all of them.
We'll cover some.
Mm-hmm.
But first, an admission by Tolkien that the word Hobbit isn't a translation by sense. It's simply an invention.
That's right. So the common speech word was Banakil, which meant halfling, but the hobbits themselves used a word that originally was supposedly not found anywhere else, Kuduk. Well, it might not be used anywhere else in that form, but Theoden used a very similar word, Kuddukan, carrying the meaning hole builder.
That word was translated by Tolkien very much in a translation by sense, as Hobbitla, arguing that Hobbit might very well be a word that would represent a worn-down form of Hobbitla if that name had occurred in our own ancient language.
And once again, this is Tolkien sort of like, not retconning, but going back in time. Like he'd already come up with the word Hobbit. Okay, but wait a second. How would that have become a word? Well, Hobbit could be a broken down version of Hobbitla, hole builder. And let's apply that to whatever we decide is the common speech version of their name. It's fascinating. Then we get a close look at the last name of Gamgee, which was actually in common speech Galbasi, or simply Galpsy, shortened to Galpsy.
And this was a name that originated in the name of a village, Gulabas, from a Hobbit word gulab, meaning game, like deer or the like, and a suffix that's similar to wick or witch. If gulab means game, Tolkien reasoned, let's just take that word and add the village suffix of witch, hence Gamich.
Yeah. But then to reflect the shortening of Galbasi to Galpsy, Tolkien reduced Gamagee to Gamgee, here explaining that no reference was intended to the connection of Samwise with the family of Cotton, though a jest of that kind would have been Hobbit-like enough. Now, back that Cotton truck up a bit. What jests? And why would Gamgee have a connection with the Cotton family, other than after the fact, of course? I mean, what's going on here?
Well, maybe some of our UK listeners get this joke, but let's go to letter 184 to explain it for the rest of us. Tolkien is writing in March 1956 to a Mr. Sam Gamgee from London, who was not surprisingly curious about the use of the character named Sam Gamgee. He wrote, "I know it's a fiction, but it is rather a coincidence as the name is very uncommon, but well known in the medical profession." Well, that just confuses us further. So
seriously, what?
Look at Tolkien's response to help us out with this well-known in the medical profession.
What now? So Tolkien explains, the reason of my use of the name is this. I lived near Birmingham as a child, and we used Gamgee as a word for cotton wool. So in my story, the families of Cotton and Gamgee are connected. I did not know as a child, though I know now, that Gamgee was shortened from Gamgee tissue, and that it was named after its inventor, a surgeon, I think, who lived between 1828 and 1886. It was probably, I think, his son who died this year on 1st of March, aged 88. This is again in 1956, after being for many years professor of surgery at Birmingham University. Evidently, Sam, or something like it, is associated with the family, though I never knew this until a few days ago when I saw Professor Gamgee's obituary notice and saw that he was son of Samson Gamgee, and looked in a dictionary and found that the inventor was S. Gamgee, 1828 to 86, and probably the same. Wow. What? You've got to be kidding me. I mean, this is so Hobbity, really?
It is, and we'll get to an even better example, I think, with the Brandywine.
Oh my goodness,
in a
yes.
moment, just in terms of Hobbit jokes and puns. But this whole thing, of course, gives Tolkien an excuse to explore the name Cotton, which he says represents the Hobbit name Hlothran, derived from an element Hloth, meaning a two-roomed dwelling or hole, so not a studio apartment, but a small place nonetheless, and Ranu, meaning a small group of these dwellings on a hillside.
Quick sidebar, by the way. Go back to Hamfast's Hobbit name. Ranugad uses that exact same common speech element, Ranu, the name meaning stay at home.
Yep. And since as a name, it's basically cottager, Tolkien's given them the name Cotton.
Mm-hmm. And then finally we get an explanation, and it's a short explanation, really, considering how long this could have gone on, of the name of the river Brandywine. Now, I know it seems obvious on the surface, right? You've got the Elvish Branduin from Baran, golden brown. We see that, by the way, in the name of the river, but also one other place, the hill of Dol Baran, where Pippin looked in the Palantir, and Duin, large river, which we also see in the name of the Anduin.
Exactly, yeah. So the hobbits, for once, name something in connection with the elves, and it gets corrupted from Baranduin to Brandywine. But wait, that's a translated word, and besides, that's far too simple for Tolkien.
That's right.
The actual hobbit name was Brandanin, which had the meaning border water. Tolkien says a more accurate translation would have been something like Marchborn.
Mm-hmm.
But the hobbits had already changed Brandanin, border water, to Braldahim, heady ale, in reference to the colour. So Brandywine isn't a modern English corruption of Barad-dûn, but a translation of Braldahim, heady ale.
That's just wild. I absolutely love that. But I've got to go to F2 for this because there's something even more entertaining here. Tolkien writes that Branduin was by the hobbits picturesquely perverted into Branduhim, signifying in their tongue foaming beer, from the elements brand or brandu, foam, and hima, beer. I have imitated this by calling the river the Brandywine, similar in sound and a very possible corruption of Branduin, although the sense is not very closely similar. There is, in fact, no evidence for the distillation of brandy in the Shire. No
brandy. We really should end with that tragedy.
Yeah, that's true. That's
no brandy. Yeah.
All right. Well, on that tragic note,
I do want to say though that translating puns and wordplay is one of the most difficult things to do for a translator.
So many levels.
It makes me think of the amazing work that Michael Everson does, publishing translations of, well, not only The Hobbit, but Alice in Wonderland. Right, Alice in Wonderland is full of wordplay.
Yeah,
and yet he publishes translations of it in over 100 different languages, and each of those translators has to work out, how am I going to convey these puns and wordplay? It's an amazing task, and it's fun to see Tolkien do this too.
It really is.
Okay, so we're not gonna end on the no brandy
on the brandyless tragedy.
We get to close Appendix F with how this relates to the name of the Old Bucks, who became the Brandy Bucks.
Right.
Their original Hobbit name, Zaragamba, was translated as Old Bucks. But when they moved to the Buckland, they changed their name, not to Brandybuck, obviously, as that's the translation,
right,
but from Zaragamba to Brandagamba.
Now, that first element, Branda, we now know means borderland. But even though the Brandanin was now called the Braldahim, no one in their right mind would call the master of Buckland Braldagamba, which would be the equivalent of heady buck or foamy-headed buck if we include that F2 explanation. And I just have to say, and I want to talk about this for a little bit, it is so Tolkien to end everything, because this is the end of the appendices, with a linguistic joke that he leaves the reader to figure out on their own. He doesn't even explain that to us.
Yes.
It's brilliant and awful and great. And just, fantastic. I love that. I don't even know if there's anything to be said about that other than that is so Tolkien.
Yeah. Yeah.
It really is. Now, we hear rumor that Barlaam Butterbur and his team over at the Prancing Pony Inn have, in fact, learned how to distill brandy. So disaster averted. James, what does Barlaam, the master brandy distiller, have for us tonight?
So we have a great question here from Anne in Toronto, who raises a question that I think is going to lead to something that's bothered me for a while in relation to all the stuff we've talked about. Yeah,
just what I want to do, bother James.
Anne asks, if Tolkien used Old English for the names of the Rohirrim to make it sound like an older form of our language, what do translations of Lord of the Rings do? In other words, if you have a Spanish translation, we talk so much in Appendix F about Tolkien wanting alien to sound alien, but familiar to sound familiar, and all these analogies that he did, right?
Right,
so
right.
Does that mean that if you're reading a Spanish translation of Lord of the Rings, that the Rohirrim speak an older form of Spanish?
Huh.
If you read the Chinese translation, the Rohirrim speaking an older form of Chinese. Do the men of the Dale speak a northern dialect of
Oh.
And I mean, the short answer is, as far as I can tell, no, which seems like a really lost opportunity until you dive into, I'm going to say nomenclature. I'm sorry, I can't bring myself to say nomenclature.
Nomenclature.
But Tolkien wrote a document called Nomenclature of the Lord of the Rings. It was first published in a Tolkien Compass in 1975. Christopher did some editing, and the chapter's titled "The Guide to the Names in the Lord of the Rings."
Right.
And it was something that his father had written as a guide to translators and how to deal with all of the stuff that he says. And it starts off saying, it goes through and gives a whole long list of how to deal with various names.
Right.
But it starts off saying, all names not in the following list should be left entirely unchanged in any language used in translation. So in other words, he's going to give a list of things, but if it's not on the list, do not translate it at all. But then he says it is desirable that the translator should read Appendix F or listen to this podcast episode.
Please do.
And follow the theory there set out.
What is that theory that's set out?
Well, I think it's clear from all the stuff we've discussed in this episode, this methodical...
Translation by sense.
By sense, but also maintaining an analogical relationship between the languages. So the familiar stays familiar, things that are maybe a little distant, and then stuff that are wholly alien remain wholly alien.
Right.
But that's not what he lays out in the rest of the nomenclature. He seems to take a much more black and white approach of, if it's common speech, translate it. If it's not, keep it exactly as is. Which suggests Tolkien would not have wanted the Chinese translation to change the Rohinese, but that would lead to, it's very odd in light of all the stuff we've read, because I'll read some examples, because he does talk about specific words, and it'll give a flavor of sort of what Tolkien had in mind that other translators should do.
Right.
So the first one I'm just going to read is how he says to deal with Sackville Baggins.
Ah, yes, that's a great one.
So Sackville Baggins, he says, Sackville is an English name of more aristocratic association than Baggins. It is, of course, joined in the story with Baggins because of the similar meaning in English equals common speech, sack and bag, and because of the slightly comic effect of this conjunction. Any compound in the language of translation containing elements meaning more or less the equivalent of sack, bag will do. So in other words, in the case of Sackville Baggins, he wants you to translate that. He wants the joke to pass in whatever the word for sack is, whatever the word for bag is, do something with that kind of retains the joke. So that's a case where he does want it. There's an interesting one in the case of Sharky. He says, Sharky is supposed to be a nickname modified to fit the common speech in the English text, anglicised, based on the Orcish Sharku, old man. The word should therefore be kept with modification of spelling to fit the language of translation, alteration of the diminutive and quasi-affectionate ending E to fit that language would also be in place. So in other words, keep the shark.
Because that's from Orcish Sharku.
Because that's Orcish.
Right.
But whatever your language does to make things affectionate or diminutive, do that to shark. So that's a really interesting combination.
That's an edge case, yeah.
We keep the alien soundingness, but do something to it that's local to the language of translation.
Okay.
But then we get Firian.
Oh, like Firian wood. Okay.
I would expect, given everything that we discussed and read in Appendix F, that Tolkien would have wanted that translated to something
like an old word for mountain, because that's what that is, right?
Right. So, and this is what he says. I mean, this is still helpful from a linguistic point of view, but it's odd the instructions he gives. He says, Firien, an old Rohan name representing an old word, Old English Firgen, pronounced Firien, for mountain. Compare Halifirian, Holy Mount. As belonging to the language of Rohan, Firien should be retained.
So the language of Rohan is to be retained.
He says, and he continues on, I'll skip to the end. He says, in a translation, it would be best to leave both unaltered, both Firian Feld and Firian Holt, as being alien, not common speech names.
Okay, so we lose the ability to connect that older language to the common speech.
Which I think is seen. I would love readers who have read Lord of the Rings in other languages, if they're native to that language, if there are any examples where the translator has gone ahead and tried to do this analogical representation of Rohanese in something, an older form of their language.
Maybe the concern is that it just couldn't be done in all languages because there isn't always an older enough
or known,
or too old, or it's not known.
Or Tolkien didn't trust the ability of the translator to, because I mean, we've seen the amount of work that Tolkien went to to construct these analogies and everything.
You can't expect a translator to take a finished work and put that amount of effort into it. That's a vast amount of work.
Given the philological knowledge
and the skill. That's the thing. I mean, Tolkien's a genuine expert in this sort of thing.
Exactly.
And these translators are going to be very talented, very skilled people to be able to do that, but they're not going to have that philological background.
Which makes it all the more odd that he says, follow the theory there set out. He wants people to follow the theory in Appendix F, but then all his examples go against that. So
maybe he's literally only talking about translation by sense only and getting rid of the connection to the older language. But that seems to break the story in a few ways.
So I'd love to know if people have read, coming back to Anne's question.
Yeah.
I think it's clear what Tolkien has said he wanted in the nomenclature, but what have the translation? Has anyone actually tried it? Has anyone done a?
Because it does. I'm thinking now it really does break that part of the story where Mary talks about how he could catch snippets of their speech and understand it. Really? Why? Because if you're reading it, like you said, in Spanish, for instance,
or Chinese,
and they're speaking something really alien, like a totally different language group. Yeah, you're reading it in, let's say, Mandarin, and how in the world would Mary pick up Old English as being connected with Mandarin? Like, that doesn't make any sense at all.
If it used classical Chinese or something like that, I think it would be really fascinating, right?
Right. Something dating back to, the Han Dynasty or something.
Exactly, right.
But that's wild.
Yes. I'd love readers who have read it, who are non-native English speakers who've read it in their own first language. Be really interested to know what they've done. But it seems clear that Tolkien did not
succeeded in that.
It seems contrary to his instruction to follow the theory set out in Appendix F that's not actually what Tolkien.
No, it's not what he wants. Clearly, because the nomenclature was written very much to address real world problems that were already happening.
Yes.
I mean, in translations that had already come out, that he was like, no, this is not going to work.
Because this came out after, I believe it was the Dutch and Swedish translations had been made.
Yeah, certainly the Swedish one had been made. And for some reason, my brain thought this was in leading up to the Dutch translation. Maybe you're right. It might be after.
I've got an association in my mind with it.
Yeah, I know there's a connection with it, but my thought he was writing it to specifically that was the next translation this was to apply to, but I could be wrong on that.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing there is if you are translating into another Germanic language, and Tolkien does talk about this a little bit in the nomenclature, that if you're translating into another Germanic language, a lot of his tricks could just be carried across.
Absolutely.
So I would understand that. If you're translating into Dutch, it would be entirely appropriate to retain the Rohan representation as Old English. That would almost certainly work. But to do that with something else, maybe he didn't have that in mind. Maybe he hadn't even considered translation into Mandarin or Arabic or...
That's true. He may not have thought of it being translated to anything other than other Germanic languages, or at least at the very most distant, Latin-based European languages.
Yeah. Yeah, how would Spanish be treated? How would French be treated, and so on? So, if anyone knows, I'd love to know examples of how it's been treated. Brazilian Portuguese, I should check with my friends who have been involved in that, how they handled it.
I do wonder, and I know that there are some letters. I'm going to have to go back into the letters because I know that there are a series of letters that he wrote. Sort of around this
complaining about
translations, but also talking about translations and how we can help the translators. These were all like in the mid 50s and things. I want to say like 56, 57 were where most of them came about.
There's a funny series of letters where he says in a more public letter, he says that he's not a linguist, but then in another letter he says, I'm a professional linguist. Like
right.
Depending on his audience, much like we talked before, Aragorn can speak differently depending on his audience. Tolkien did similarly with regard to how confident he claimed to be about his linguistic abilities.
Wow. Well, that was fascinating. It was a good question. And I think, like you said, there's really no singular answer because it does seem to be irreconcilable in some ways. Certainly when you look at some of the letters that he's written, and we may take a look at those again in the P5. But folks, for now, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast and for our time in the appendices to the Lord of the Rings. But be sure to join us again next week as we wrap up season 9 with a very special interview we know you'll enjoy.
Yes, it's going to be a really fun interview.
Yeah.
Alan and I want to thank the members of Team PPP, editor Jordan Rennells, Barliman Becca Davis, social media manager Casey Hilsey, event and Patreon community coordinator Katie McKenna, graphic artist Megan Collins, and website guru Phil Dean.
Now, please take a minute to check out theprancingponypodcast.com. That's where you'll find show notes, outtakes, Prancing Pony ponderings, as well as our online storefront, where you can get PPP merch featuring all the great episode artwork that Megan's been doing for the show since the start of season 7.
You'll also want to visit our library page. The Prancing Pony Podcast is, after all, a podcast about the books. So if you're interested in a book we've mentioned on the show, you'll find a link for it in our library. We do get a small amount of compensation when you make your purchase, and we thank you for that.
Indeed, we do. We also want to thank our patrons at the Kierden's contribution tier. I'll start with Demay in Alaska, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Joseph in Michigan, Kathy from North Carolina, Carlos in California, Brian in the UK, Jerry from Washington, Joe in Washington, Erwin from the Netherlands, Ben in Minnesota, Anthony in Texas, Zaksu in Illinois, Sarah in New Jersey, Joshua in Massachusetts, Lucy in Texas, Keith in Alabama, Erica in Texas, Vivian in California, and James in Massachusetts.
There's also Anne in Kentucky, Sean in New Jersey, Mason in California, Maureen from Massachusetts, Olivia in London, Robert in Arizona, Nick in Wisconsin, Lewis in South Carolina, Thomas in Germany, Craig in California, Bailey in Texas, Kevin in Massachusetts, Julie in Washington, Bruce in California, Joe in Maryland, Nathan in Arizona, Kevin in Pennsylvania, Tom in Pennsylvania, and Jeff in Michigan. Thank you all so very much for your support.
Indeed, thank you.
Now make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Subscribe now through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcast app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your complex explanations for translating Hobbit names to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
And if you want your voice literally heard, well, just send us audio of your question. Visit podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your question for us. Be sure to still email the question to Barliman, though.
Please do. Now, even though Barliman's been a lot more reliable lately, there is still a lot of mail to sort through. We'll try to get to you just as soon as we're able. As always, though, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time,
may you rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill.